So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. And as I'm doing this, we're going to go ahead and switch screen share there. So first of all, we're going to be joined by Dr. Quinn Sorensen, who's a postdoc scholar in the Latimer Lab, and also by Dr. Derek Young, who's a research ecologist. And this project is done in partnership with Professor Andrew Latimer, and all three are in the Department of Plant Sciences at UC Davis. All right, whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks a lot. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you for coming today. Let me just share my screen. And here we go. All right, so thanks everybody for coming. I'm really excited to talk about our study today. It seems very timely and hopefully important after this past fire season, where we expect planting to be happening a lot all over California. So I'll just jump right in. All right, so welcome to the yellow pine mixed conifer system of the Sierra Nevada. So if you're in yellow pine mixed conifer, you're looking at something like this. You're in the mid elevations of the Sierra Nevada. You're seeing widely spaced mature trees, not much of a mid-story, and herbaceous or shrubby understory. In this area, this vegetation structure is maintained by frequent and low intensity fire, or at least historically it was. And on the left, you'll see the historical range of the yellow pine mixed conifer system. It goes north and south through the Sierra Nevada, typically on the western edges, especially in the south. And then on the right, you'll see a figure from Safford and Stevens 2017, the natural range of variation for yellow pine mixed conifer. And you'll notice a lot of blue in this area, which signifies a change in the fire return interval. So over the last century, fire has actually decreased in frequency in this forest, which has had consequences for that vegetation structure. Historically, it burned 7 to 20 years approximately, and now we're seeing a lot longer time between burning. Okay. And so in addition to that reduced fire frequency, we're seeing a change in the amount of high severity fire. So here's another figure from that paper. And I want you to focus in on these areas over here that represent our system. And so we're comparing the historical proportion of low, moderate, and high severity fire to what we see now. And what you'll notice is a drastic decrease in the amount of low severity fire and a pretty dramatic increase in high severity fire. And that's likely due to a history of fire suppression. And so over the past century, many of the low intensity fires in the system have been put out by people, which has led to the increase in buildup of surface fuels and the development of ladder fuels, which lead to those high severity fires that burn hotter and bring fire into the canopy, which ultimately results in the death of many overstory trees. And so we see fires like this, where much of the forest is being dramatically changed, and consequences like this, where people who live there are impacted, and often their livelihood is impacted. And this matters to us because it not only impacts where we live, but trees that we depend on for timber production, water filtration, carbon storage, recreation, habitat for wildlife. This forest is really important, and so we need to understand how to take care of it. And so one consequence of these severe fires is that they're changing the way that they're not only changing the severity and the frequency, but also fire size has been changing. And so over the past century, fires are also getting larger. So here we see a similar or a figure from that same paper showing that the historical average size of a fire is increasing 7-fold. And the consequence of this is that forest regeneration is being impacted. It's being impacted because the natural regeneration that you see here of small seedlings depends on a mature live tree to provide seeds to disperse to a burned area. So in this forest, I'm sure many people know that these trees don't seed bank very readily, and so depend on dispersal. And so with the increase in fire size and the severity killing many of the trees in those burned areas, and we're seeing areas after fire being converted to shrub fields. So you see something like this where it once was a dense forest, but there are few live trees remaining, and it's being converted to a shrub field. So given the importance of this forest, we have some tools to combat this type conversion of the loss of forest, and that's planting tree seedlings. And so in these areas where we have large, intense fires, we can plant tree seedlings in hopes of regenerating the forest. But we need to know where to plant conifers. And so recently there's been a lot of discussion about how to prioritize tree planting. There's been a lot of focus on dispersal, figuring out where regeneration is going to not do so well, thinking about, like in this White and Long paper, where to prioritize tree planting given that there's variation in water or other natural variation that might impact tree seedling success. And so in this presentation, we're going to talk about some empirical data that we collected in order to try to get deeper into the nuance and the complexity of where forest regeneration will fail and where tree planting will be most successful. But first, we have to think about what it is that tree planting does ecologically. And so if you think about natural regeneration, for a tree to establish, it has to first disperse and then germinate and grow through some of the most small sensitive stages. And you might expect that as a tree develops and grows, it's increasing its resilience to stress from the environment. And conversely, you might expect that as it grows, it's decreasing its sensitivity to environmental stressors. So going back to tree planting, when we plant trees, we're actually bypassing these processes of dispersal and that early sensitivity to environmental stresses. So we want to hone in on how we can bypass dispersal and these stages that are stressful to the environment and identify those environmental stressors that are important for establishment. So our objective here is to predict where tree planting will be most beneficial. And that's given the limited resources that managers have to implement tree planting, variation in the transplant survival, and variation in natural regeneration. And so you wouldn't want to plant trees in places you know that those transplants are not going to survive. But then you also don't want to plant trees in places where you know natural regeneration will do really well. So we want to understand that sweet spot where natural regeneration will likely fail, but it's not so stressful that the transplants that you put there won't survive. And then we had a practical objective, which was to create a planting prioritization tool, which we'll talk about in depth at the second half of this webinar. And so our overarching question to this study was, can we use environmental variation to predict where tree planting is needed and will increase tree density the most? And so to do this, we sampled areas that were planted and unplanted across 5 different sites. So we did it in the Cottonwood Fire, the American River Fire, the Moonlight and Antelope fires we combined because they were close together, the Pipe Fire, and the Power Fire. And then within each of these fires, on the left, you'll see just some polygons of where the fire was planted and not planted. And it may look misleading because the planted areas are in tan, but that's just the color of the transparent polygon. They're really pretty similar in color. But we focused in on areas of high severity burning. And then we put in these paired plots that straddled the boundary between planting and unplanting or non-planted areas. And then what's important to note is that those boundaries were arbitrary. They weren't based on any sort of like environmental transition or change that would impede planting. They were just places where the planting had to stop somewhere. And so we took advantage of this arbitrary pairing of planted and unplanted to investigate how the environmental variation across those pairs affected the success of the planted plots. And then the plots were 11 meters in diameter, and that was important so that we could capture a wider area given variation in tree mortality. And they spanned a wide range of environmental variation. Within each fire, we had 15 to 25 pairs per site. And then they were sampled 7 to 20 years after the planting so that we could assess what trees that were likely to continue surviving. And then within each fire, they were either planted 1, 2, or 3 years after the fire, and that actually varied within fires as well. And then you can imagine that the forests across the Sierra Nevada have had a pretty wide-ranging management history, and so we took into account the management history of these sites, and we try to have sites that were pretty much run-of-the-mill average management. So they're similar, even if they're not exactly the same. Okay, so from these sites, we focused on seedling density as our measure of regeneration or regeneration success. And this seedling density metric, it includes both planted and unplanted seedlings. That's because after 7 to 20 years, you really can't tell very easily which ones were natural and which ones were planted. So we focused on just overall seedling density. And we wanted to understand how this wide range of environmental variation determines seedling density. And to do that, we broke up the environmental variation into 4 different areas. So we wanted to understand how dispersal affected seedling density, climate, competition, and microsite availability. And recognizing that each of these can lead to changes in seedling density. And so, first of all, for dispersal, we measured the distance to the nearest seed source. And then for climate, we measured normal annual precipitation, temperature, and solar radiation. For competition, we measured shrub cover. And it's important to note that shrub cover here is the shrub cover at the time of sampling, which is not the same as the time of planting. And so this measure of shrub cover is more, could be better interpreted as shrub productivity on that site. So whether or not it's going to be a good or poor place for shrubs to grow. And we also took into account the timing of planting. And then for the microsite conditions, we looked at litter and Duff depth, topographic position index, which is just a measure of whether it's closer to a valley bottom or a ridge top, elevation, and slope. So looking at all these, it's important to note that we were interested in predicting seedling density across a variety of years. And so most of these metrics are averages across years or things that aren't going to change temporally. So for example, like we measured climate, normal annual precipitation, rather than rainfall the year of planting, because weather varies temporally. So all of these things can impact seedling density, but we also wanted to understand how planting can change the relationship between these factors and seedling density. Because it might be that climate or competition affect natural regeneration, and ergo seedling density, but that planting might change that relationship. And so after collecting all this data, we built a model, including these variables and testing them to see which ones affected seedling density. But then importantly, we focused on how these factors interact with planting. So I want to take a moment to sort of unpack what interactions mean in this model and then how to interpret them with some sort of with some examples. So here we can imagine that on the x-axis we have a gradient of high stress on the left to low stress, and then our response variable on the y-axis is seedling density. So that's, you know, our measure of regeneration success. And then this dashed line into the middle represents a target density that a manager might have. So that might be like the amount of trees that you would need to feel confident that regeneration has occurred, or maybe it's the amount of trees you would want for stocking a forest for timber. So in an unplanted area, you might expect something like this, where you have an increase in seedling density as you move from high stress to low stress. And then in our models, if there was no interaction with planting, that means that planting or stress didn't change the success of planting. So you'd expect something like this, where in every area across that stress gradient, you have the same increase or the same boost to seedling density. And so if you're looking at this trying to plan, you might look at the right side and think, okay, in this unplanted area, it's already exceeding our target, and planting is just going to increase it even more. So we don't want to plant there. And you look at the midsection, and you might see that the unplanted area is not meeting your target. So that would be a good place to focus on planting. But it depends on what you want. So if you are dead set on getting that target, you might focus in that area. If you really just want to get as many trees in as possible, then perhaps you're looking at that high stress area and thinking, well, if we plant here, we're going to at least get, you know, a pretty good, decent sized boost to planting or to seedling density. So that's scenario one. In the second scenario, you might have an interaction in our model, which means that planting, or the relationship between tree density and stress, changes if you plant or not. So normally in the high stress area, without planting, you'd expect a low seedling density. But in this case, planting has a much more disproportional effect in that high stress area than in the low stress. And so you might expect that this could be a scenario where planting bypasses that stressful part of the gradient, and once a tree gets big enough, it's going to survive. And so if you had a result like this, you'd be thinking, well, there's no point in adding or in planting trees in the low stress area, and there's no point in like adding and trying really hard in the high stress area, because normal effort of planting is going to give you above your target. So you could gauge your planting based on you can gauge your planting based on like where you think you need them to put in your trees the most. You have, in other words, you have kind of the availability to put it anywhere along the stress gradient. And then in the third scenario, you could imagine something like this, where in the high stress area, planting doesn't lead to very big gains in seedling density. And that could be in a case where that environmental stress moves beyond that initial establishment stage, and it's stressful even for larger seedlings. And so then you see in the low stress area of this gradient, planting has a really big boost, and that might be that that might mean that like planting is similar to natural regeneration in that they're benefiting from that really rich, resource-rich environment. So with that in mind, we're going to go through what came out as important in the model that we constructed. And unsurprisingly to me, climate, dispersal, competition, and the microsite conditions all came out as important in predicting seedling density. So first I'm going to focus on climate, and I have to add that in addition to an interaction with seedling density, we included some interactions among environmental predictors that we thought might be important. So here we have an interaction between temperature and precipitation, which can represent a gradient of water stress. And so on the x-axis, we have the yearly average minimum temperature, and then we have 3 panels of differing precipitation. So on the left, there's 600 millimeters of precipitation, which is like a dry site. The middle panel is a more modest precipitation in the middle, and then 1800 millimeters at the wetter end. So here's what we found, and I'd like to include that I included a stalking target here is the dashed line, and then that would be more like if you're trying to stalk the forest for timber harvest, and then a more ecological target if your goal is to just get forest trees out into the mountains. And so looking at this data or these results, you'll see that the planting or seedling density is the highest in areas that are wet and dry, wet and warm, or dry and cool. And I have to say that there was no interaction with planting here. So it didn't matter whether it was planted or not. The seedling density responded similarly to temperature and precipitation. And it's also important to note that we needed to log transform seedling density in our models. And so that's why the planted and unplanted curves diverge a bit. And so it's important to interpret this as the proportional increase of seedling density to temperature and precipitation. So with those caveats, we see that on the left, like if you're looking at your cool and dry areas, those probably are kind of a lower in water stress, and so you're having higher seedling density there naturally, and you're getting a proportionally similar increase in seedling density by planting. And then in the warmer, wetter areas on the right, there's a substantial increase in seedling density, and that's likely because trees need water, and metabolic processes and photosynthesis occur a lot more rapidly at higher temperatures. So if you're trying to think about where to plant based on this, you might be looking to the right and thinking that you don't want to plant in areas with that are wet and warm, because they're already going to be sustaining high levels of seedling density. But there is a pretty good boost to seedling density at those more stressful areas in the moderate range of stress. And so those might be a good place to target planting. And then for competition, we found a very interesting result with shrub cover. So here we have shrub cover on the x-axis and then seedling density on the y-axis again. And again, this is shrub cover at the time of sampling, and so it should be thought of as like shrub productivity, or this site's productivity for shrubs. And if you look at how seedling density responds to shrub cover, it's what you might expect. As shrub cover increases, seedling density decreases. So it seems like shrubs are having a negative effect on seedling density. But we found an interaction with planting and the timing of planting here. And so if you keep looking at the unplanted areas, it doesn't matter whether it was planted adjacent to it 1, 2, or 3 years. But for the areas that were planted, if they were planted 1 year after the fire, there's a large increase in seedling density in the places with the highest shrub cover. And we think this has to do with giving trees a head start to overtop shrubs and take hold. So these places where shrub cover is high, those are probably pretty productive, good places for plants to grow. But the trees are typically, without planting, being outcompeted there. By planting in the year after a fire, you can substantially increase seedling density. 2 years after a fire, there is a similar trend. You get an increase in shrub cover with, or increase in seedling density with shrub cover, but it's a lot more muted. And then 3 years after a fire, that pattern is diminished, and then you see an opposite trend. And so 3 years after a fire, seedling density is actually increased the most in the areas with the lowest shrub cover. And conversely, we think that this has to do with a facilitation effect. So those places that shrub cover is going to be the lowest, we expect are stressful to trees, and they're not going to be, as seedlings are developing, like they're not going to be overrun with shrubs, or shrub competition isn't going to be really strong there. It might be more limited by stress. And so by waiting to plant it in those more stressful environments after the shrubs have grown a bit, there might be shading or providing some sort of break from the wind that ameliorate the conditions for tree seedlings. And so you might be looking at this thinking, well, let's plant trees in the places where shrub cover is going to be high really quickly, and in the places where shrub cover is going to be low, that's the place that we can, take a breath and wait a few years to implement our planting there. In addition, we saw that the distance from seed source was important, and this is pretty well documented in the literature. So on the x-axis, we have just the minimum distance to a seed source, and there was no interaction with planting, but then we see this trend of the further away a site is from a seed source, the smaller or the lower the seedling density. And here you might, take away the point that places that are farther away likely need to be planted more than the ones that are closer to the seed source. But there's substantial variation that can be explained by the other factors like climate and competition. And lastly, we saw litter and duff was important. We saw a correlation between litter and duff and seedling density. This is a little harder to interpret because this is litter and duff at the time of sampling. And so it could be that litter and duff is correlated to a more productive environment that's better for seedlings. It could be that it ameliorates the soil in some way. It's a lot harder to attribute a cause to this relationship, but we do see it. And then lastly, we see an interaction between topographic position and elevation. So that just means that whether or not this site was near a valley or near a ridge top, how that affects seedling density depended on whether it was low or high elevation. And so the x-axis here, we have topographic position index. Again, that's on the left, more negative is closer to a valley. On the right, closer to a ridge top. And you'll see that at lower elevations, 1,200 meters, seedling density actually increases with topographic position index. So the closer you are to a ridge, actually elevates seedling density. As we increase in elevation, we saw a reversal of this trend. So that higher elevations, there's higher seedling density in the valleys, and that was strongest at the highest elevation sites. And again, this didn't interact with seedling density, and so it didn't matter whether or not you planted here. There's always like the same proportional increase in tree seedling density with planting across elevation and topography. So I'm going to conclude, and the first I want to say is that seedling density is controlled by many factors in the environment, and those factors can interact. So it's complicated or complex. So you might be looking at these results, trying to wrap your head around, well, given this topographic position and that elevation and this normal annual precipitation and that shrub cover, where the heck should I plant? So that's where our tool comes in. We're going to be talking about that shortly, but we had those same thoughts, and we used all of the patterns that we generate in this data to create a tool that can take into account all of this variation in the environment and predict whether or not you're going to have high or low seedling density in an area, and whether or not that will depend on planting, and whether that will depend on whether you plant first, second, or third year after a fire. Second, I think this is a little straightforward, that a lot of these seem to underlay water availability and stress and competition for water. In this system, water is pretty important, and so we see a lot of the controls for seedling density having to do with that. And then importantly, trees can successfully compete with shrubs, but that depends on pace of establishment. And so our recommendations are that planting should occur during the first year after a fire in areas that have high productivity, where we'd expect shrub competition to be intense. And conversely, planting in stressful sites is likely less urgent and can be saved for a few years after the fire, when shrubs might grow in and provide some shade and break from the wind. And then overall, natural regeneration is often adequate with low water stress, but planting can help in the more arid conditions, regardless of how stressful they are. And then lastly, we just want to say that predicting planting success can benefit from more strategic monitoring across more fires. So in undertaking this study, we saw there are so many factors that influence regeneration success. And we realized that we need a lot more data across a lot more planting to get further into the nuance of what controls regeneration success, and be more confident in getting exact estimates of regeneration success. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening to my presentation. It's tool time with Derek, Dr. Derek Young. And he's going to be talking about the tool we developed from this data set that we call preset. So I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Derek.
All right, everyone, welcome to tool time. Oh, what? Oh, wrong tool. Oh, that's right. I'm talking about the reforestation tool. Somehow I let them talk me into doing that. Now that I've thoroughly embarrassed myself, I will share my screen. And so, okay, so my role in this project has been in the early stages focused on the study design and data collection, but then more recently on development of this web-based reforestation tool. And so I'm really excited for today's public debut of the tool. So the tool is fondly named Preset, the post-fire reforestation success estimation tool. And I'm going to do a little walkthrough of the tool, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, to follow along. It's online, and it will reside at this link for the foreseeable future. And Stacy said she's going to paste this into the chat so that you don't have to copy it down. So the goal of the tool, as Quinn explained, was to take the patterns that he described and map them out onto a landscape to aid in planning reforestation of a future wildfire. So I'm going to jump into what this tool looks like. So when you load the site, you'll arrive at this page, which is asking for you to define your area of interest. So I recommend you start with the coarsest resolution because that's the fastest calculations, and then switch to a finer resolution later if necessary. And then it asks for a severity raster. This could be any form of severity layer from bare or ravage or MTBS. I'm going to do a demo for the creek fire from this year. And currently all that's publicly available is the bare data. The DNBR is what I'll be using. This isn't ideal for actual planning, but just for a demo, this is what I'll be using. If you're following along and you don't have a severity layer, you can actually shortcut this step by clicking the Go button, and which actually uses the same data layers are built into the app so that it'll just automatically pull them up if you hit the Go button. But if you are using your own severity layer, oops, need to jump back. If you are using your own severity layer, you will need to specify what you consider to be high severity. This allows you to set that threshold. And so when the layer loads, it will detect the range of values in the layer. And in this case, it's DNBR times 1,000. So I'm going to say 300 is what a liberal threshold for. So this is saying anything with a value of 300 and over, we're considering high severity. And then upload a perimeter for the same fire. And this has to be a single file polygon format. And if you have like a shape file, it's easy to export that as a single file format like KML from any GIS software. And so where this takes you, then it computes for about 10 seconds and brings you to this display of the predicted planting benefit. And so the first thing you'll notice is this is really patchy. The reason is this is filtered to high severity yellow pine mixed conifer only. And those filters are controlled by this, this filtering section of the toolbar. So if we want to, for example, disable the high severity filter, then we'll see all of the predictions for all of the yellow pine mixed conifer in the creek fire. So this would be like a hypothetical scenario where it burned all at high severity and we're interested in all of this area. I'm actually going to leave it like that for this demo. And so the predictions are on a relative scale from low to high of what we call planting benefit, which is the amount by which planting seedlings increases ultimate seedling density at 10 to 20 years post-fire, which coincides with the timing of our plot surveys, because that's all the data that's driving these predictions. And so I'll get into why this is on a relative scale in a little bit, but the way to interpret this is, so say you have resources to replant, say 10% of this perimeter. Let's hope you have more than that, but if that was your constraint, you might focus in on the areas with the 10% of the area with the darkest color would be maybe your top priority for planting. And so these predictions reflect the combined effect of all of the underlying environmental layers that Quinn described. I think the tool has, it's probably receiving the highest traffic that it has since we uploaded it. So apologize for the minor technical glitch, but it'll be back up in a second. So you have a few controls on the left-hand toolbar that reflect different assumptions of post-fire or management and conditions. And so the first is the planting year. And so this captures that relationship that Quinn described, where in general, planting earlier provides a greater benefit in terms of tree density down the line. If you plant it 2 years later, it's a little lower, and then 3 years, even less benefit. But it's important to note this isn't just a blanket reduction everywhere. It's actually different depending on the location. So it can, the most efficient areas to plant differ depending on what year you're doing the planting. And so this can help you identify where those fall out across the landscape. And a big reason for that variation from year to year is because of the interaction with shrub cover, like Quinn described. And so since that is such a key component of this model, there's the next control affects assumptions around shrub cover. The first option, so it's challenging because a fire burns, and using our model, we need to know what the ultimate shrub cover will be before we can make predictions. But when a fire burns, you don't know what the ultimate shrub cover is. So to address this, we built an additional predictive model using our same plot data set, which uses the underlying environmental variation like climate and topography to predict that medium-term shrub cover. So that's what is being used behind the scenes using this default option of predicted shrub cover. And I can show you what that looks like by using this other control under the layers to display and disabling planting benefit and turning on the shrub cover. And so these are those predictions across the landscape. If you think you know better than this, which could very well be the case since these are pretty coarse relationships that we had to use to fit this into a regional tool, you can override those predictions using the other options under the shrub cover control. I went over the map filtering. I'll switch back to the planting benefit and switch to 2 years. You can filter by high severity, by yellow pine mixed conifer. And then the last option is to exclude the low model confidence areas. What this does is it excludes the areas where the underlying environmental conditions are well outside of the range of the plot data that are behind all of these predictions, so that we don't extrapolate too far beyond our data. And you can see on the creek fire what this does, it removes a lot of the hot and dry lower elevation areas where we don't have a lot of plot data. So a future improvement to the tool could involve collecting more data in the structure of our data set that Quinn described in a broader range of environmental conditions, which would give us more confidence across the region. So enabling this tool makes calculations quite a bit slower because it's also computing uncertainty. So I recommend you do most of the exploration with this off. And then once you have everything set, you can toggle it off and on to get a sense of where there's high confidence versus low confidence. And then finally, you can download the prediction layer so that you can manipulate it and inspect it more closely in GIS, and potentially even merge multiple predictions that you made under different assumptions, like different shrub cover assumptions, based on what you expect the reality to be across your landscape. Okay, now jumping back to why are we using this relative scale? This is relativized in the sense that it's relativized within a fire, so that it'll show you within the fire where is planting predicted to have the biggest impact. But it's tricky because it's not on an absolute scale. It won't tell you what the predicted seedling density is, which of course is probably what you most want to know. And why can't we do that? The reason is because of these many site-specific factors that are hard to account for on a fire-by-fire level. So the first is natural regeneration, which has this intricate relationship with seed source density. Post-fire weather, so wetter conditions post-fire can lead to higher density of natural regen, but also greater survival of planted trees. Management method can hugely impact the long-term or even medium-term density of planted seedlings. Other local nuances like soil type. These are a lot of axes of variation that would be too much to account for within this project. This would require stratifying plots along all of these axes, and it would rapidly explode and become unwieldy. So our predictions are for essentially the average across all of these conditions across all of our study fires. So essentially the average management across all of the fires, we predict the outcome of that management. But that's not, you're never using the average management on a fire, which is why absolute density predictions are meaningless or not so direct, or about as useful as relative predictions of the type that we're making. There are a few complementary tools that can help get at some of these challenges. So the PostScript tool by Kristen Shive and colleagues, and then the forthcoming PostScriptor by Micah Wright and Joseph Stewart and colleagues it's a upgrade to PostScript that adds a nice user interface. And these tools do really good at getting at the intricacies of the natural regeneration question and the post-fire weather variation. And there's some work going on in the Safford lab at UC Davis looking at how competing vegetation control can affect the long-term or medium-term seedling survival and growth. So our recommendation is to use these complementary tools for to identify where natural regen might be weak as potential candidates, and then use preset to identify whether planting is predicted to be successful in those locations. If we were able to account for all these nuances in a tool with, a utopian scenario where we can collect thousands of plots of data from in this sort of format, then we would be able to get to a point where we could predict absolute seedling densities with some greater confidence. And so just to briefly illustrate what that would look like, the tool includes a beta mode that you can enable to enable those absolute density predictions. So let me just pull that up really quick. I'll just take a couple seconds to load. So here's our relative predictions plot. And then if we click this button on the bottom left, enable beta tools, that will adds this additional tool on the control panel where you specify your acceptable seedling density range. And then your predictions are classified based on whether or not the density falls within your range. So yellow means you're below the acceptable density range, even if you plant. So that these areas might not be good candidates for planting. The green is that predicts you'd be within the acceptable density range if you plant. So natural regen alone isn't enough, but if you plant, you can get there. The darker green is you'll be there regardless of whether you plant. So their natural regen is strong enough or predicted to be. And then planting, if say we were to plant the first year post-fire, we see a lot more of this green and a few additional categories in a few little areas, notably the dark blue is you're within the acceptable density range if you don't plant. This means natural regen is enough. And here actually planting can be counterproductive. It can result in overstocking. And this is an important thing to highlight. Just because planting is predicted to be successful in terms of increasing seedling density doesn't necessarily mean it's desirable. It might actually be a waste or counterproductive. So just, and then just to note that you're probably thinking, how can you predict that you'd be below the acceptable density range even with planting? Couldn't you tailor the planting to, say it's a really harsh site, tailor the, say competing vegetation control, make it more intensive to encourage those seedling survival? And that's absolutely true. And that really gets at the core of why it's difficult to make absolute density predictions. These are, again, are the predictions for average management, not for like a specific management scenario. And it's absolutely true that adjusting the management intensity could help to overcome limitations in harsh sites. So just to emphasize again, these are experimental demo tools just to show what would be possible with more plot data. So that's it for the tool walkthrough, other than to mention there's a user guide here on interpreting the outputs and inputs, technical details on what's happening behind the scenes, and about page with here's my contact info if you have any questions or suggestions. Love to hear from you. So just to wrap up really quick, just to reiterate and sound like a broken record, the absolute density predictions are in beta mode for the time being. We should focus on using the relative predictions. We recommend using preset in conjunction with these complementary tools, PostScript and the forthcoming PostScriptor. And interpret the predictions critically. Keep in mind, like I was describing, how natural regen might be sufficient even where reforestation is predicted to be effective. So avoid planting where it's unnecessary or might even result in overstocking. And maybe even more importantly, keep in mind, due to climate change and past forest encroachment, it might not make sense to replant forest everywhere that there historically was forest. And this tool doesn't incorporate those considerations. Future directions for preset include, so currently the spatial domain is the Sierra Nevada because that's where we have plot data. So collecting more data from other regions would allow us to expand to a broader domain. Incorporate management variation, which would entail collecting plot data from fires that had a variation in management within the fire so that we can capture that effect and then predict for different types of management, say planting density, different intensity of competing vegetation control. And then we're really happy to receive feedback and do the best we can to implement any requests down the line. So huge thanks, especially to all the Forest Service staff who helped us understand the intricacies of post-fire reforestation in the Forest Service, and especially the management that was done at our study sites. Our UC Davis collaborators, Andrew Latimer and Kevin Welch, and our field crew, who without them, we would have no data for any of this. And thanks to the Joint Fire Science Program for funding. And so that's it. We're happy to take questions now or after, and here's our contact information.
Thanks so much, Derek and Quinn. I want to mention that as a child of the 90s, I also deeply appreciated the tool time reference from Home Improvement there. Totally got it.
Okay, it was worth it.
Yeah. So I just put a evaluation survey in the chat, and I know everyone's favorite thing to do is take a survey, but it really does help us, first of all, know that this webinar was the type of webinar that you needed to hear, that you were looking for in this type of information. And it also means that we can report back to our funders that, yeah, this type of work is important and valuable. So it takes less than 5 minutes probably at the end of this if you would just want to go to that. Quickly fill in some multiple choice answers. It's, I promise, pretty painless. So we had a couple of questions in the chat and a couple in the Q&A, so we'll just kind of bounce around. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour too, so I'll mention this webinar is recorded and I'll send everyone the link. So if you do need to take off at 4, feel free. But I know I checked in with our presenters and we're going to be able to go over a little bit today with some Q&A. So the first one we got in the chat was during Dr. Sorensen's presentation, and it was, how did you define high severity? Is it based on overstory mortality or on soil burn severity?
It was based on, well, first it was based on remote sensing of the burn severity, but then it was ground truth with looking at how many mature trees died in the area. Is that right,
Yeah,
Derek?
Overstory mortality.
Yeah. So overstory mortality is a short answer.
Great. We're starting off with a nice easy one there. The next one is, when you're looking at whether a site should be planted or not, and it's based on natural regeneration potential, is there climate change a consideration in that decision, given that there's a body of building evidence that the trees that are currently on site might not be the best ones suited to be there in the future? Or is it just that it's beyond your research or your time? And I think, Derek, I think you kind of mentioned that was one of your considerations in the model, that adds a lot of variability. But if you wanted to talk any more about climate change and how that's affecting your process and model, I know it's on the tip of many of our minds.
Yes, yes. It's actually, so it's climate change is not explicitly incorporated in this model. That's because we focus more on the planting and leave the detailed modeling of the natural regeneration to the other projects like the Shive work and Joseph Stewart and Micah Wright's work that I referenced. The new tool, Postscriptor, and then the publication that's forthcoming in Ecological Applications addresses that exactly, how climate change affects is predicted to affect natural regeneration outcomes. So that's another reason why I really encourage using those tools in conjunction with ours. Ours does not get at those nuances of natural regeneration. That's a really good question because that is important.
All right, great. Yeah, it's so complicated, but any tool is better than no tool, right? This is another great question that I was curious about. Did you ever keep track of whether there was salvage logging at any of these sites? And if so, was there an effect on seedling density?
Yes. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we did. And no, there wasn't an effect of salvage logging on seedling density.
Yeah, that it's so we did our best to keep the management constant within each fire. So there is variation across fires, mostly in where some fires most of our plots were or all of our plots were salvage, and other fires, all of them weren't, most for the most part. And so that makes it tricky to detect an effect of salvage because there's so many other variables that can vary from one fire to the next, including the post-fire weather and other local factors. so this study wasn't really designed to have high power to detect those effects, but with what we do have, we didn't detect anything, but that doesn't mean that there is no effect.
Yeah.
So for my panelists, we're going to jump over to the 4 questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to read them. Some of them are kind of long, but if you need to reference them, you can look at them yourselves there. So the first one is from Greg, and it says, is there a relatively easy way to take a GBD file for burn severity and export a .tif? I don't know if that's a TIFF or a .tif. It's my own lack of knowledge there. Severity raster for step 1 in the tool. So for example, I'm not sure how to take this certain type of file that they have a draft of the North Complex Vegetation burn severity and turn it into the TIFF file that you imported in that step 1. And if the answer is go ask somebody who has experience, that's fine too, but just wondering if they were on the right track.
I think that might be my best advice. Yeah, it's definitely possible. I would recommend maybe like Googling a tutorial or yeah, asking someone, but it's definitely a pretty straightforward process, and it can be done.
I'll be with you there. I would not know how to do that. So Googling might be your friend there. The next one is, isn't species composition important as well, not just tree density?
Yeah, we think so too. Unfortunately, I mean, we thought a lot about tree composition, and we're still trying to see what this data set can tell us about composition, but adding composition increases. I mean, we had so many factors in our model already that was predicting tree density, that by trying to include species in there was not, I mean, we weren't able to do that. So, I mean, unfortunately, we weren't able to like address composition. So yes, I mean, to answer the question, yeah, it's important. It's just, we weren't really able to adequately address it with the data that we had. And there's just a lot of variation going into what the composition was, and we didn't have enough data to really nail that down. Derek,
Yeah,
does that sound about?
Yeah,
I
think I would add that we specifically evaluated the density of species that were planted. So which is largely pines in most sites. So with some exceptions, of course, but so we're focused on the species of reforestation interest. But yes, because there is so much variation in species from one site to the next, it really kind of fragments the data set so much that it makes it difficult to find any reliable patterns. So that's another area where more data could really help.
Is there any other tool you'd recommend if you were looking more at species composition?
I believe the new PostScriptor does get at least at genus, if not also species. And in terms of natural regeneration, but I don't believe there are any tools for predicting outcomes of reforestation at a species-specific level.
Great. I mean, it's complicated, right? It always comes back to that. I think that this might be a good follow-up to that one. So this was an interesting tool, and they were wondering if there might be any overlap or if it might be a complement to the post-mortality restoration prioritization tool from Steele. Is that one that you already mentioned?
That's yes, we absolutely should have mentioned that, and that's I apologize for that. Yes, that tool also would be really valuable. It is, I think it focuses on using like underlying environmental variation, and it takes a different approach in that it allows the user to specify criteria with different and apply different weights to different criteria, like depending on what's most important to you. And so also another very complementary tool, and I totally apologize for not including it. Really should have.
Okay, and we have a couple more coming in. We just did that one. So the next one is, does the tool account for variation of species being planted, or does it assume you're planting the same species as was removed by the fire?
I can answer that one. So it doesn't account for it specifically. For each area that was planted, there's the species that were planted by the manager, and so we assume those are like species of interest or priority species, and so it accounts for species in the way that they are, I mean, like Derek said before, species that are of interest of regenerating in that specific site.
Great, and this one was also put in the chat, so we're gonna jump to this one real quick. Have you used this tool to do a Sierra Nevada analysis of how much post-fire restoration is desirable or a reasonable target?
We have not done that. That would definitely be a valuable analysis, and I guess that's highly kind of value and stakeholder dependent. And so I think we were focused more on sort of the empirical natural patterns in this analysis, but I think this could help to inform analysis like is being suggested of like targets for extent of reforestation. Absolutely, but we haven't gone there yet, but that's definitely a good next direction to go.
And then, forgive me, I was trying to follow this in the chat. There was some discussion going on from a couple different people that was about how seed source clearly mattered for natural regeneration. And does that factor into the tool predictions? Derek, I think you kind of touched on that during your tool talk. But in other words, does the spatial model reduce planting benefits near the boundaries of patches? Or is the benefit in this case agnostic about whether planting might be redundant to natural regen? So just kind of that balance and exchange.
That's a great clarifying question. And yes, it can be redundant. It does not reduce benefit where natural regen is predicted to be strong. So benefit is simply the amount by which seedling density is increased by planting. So that's why we recommend using this in conjunction with the tools that are really take a more detailed approach to predicting natural regen. A workflow could include using one of those natural regen tools to first mask out or focus on the areas where natural regen is predicted to be weak, and then use our tool specifically in those areas. Great question.
I think I see our last one here is just kind of more of a comment about how important composition and seed production and how crucial that is, and just an example from the Slatter fire that they wanted to put in as some reference point there. Looks like we're just about at 10 after. So I think that's most of our questions. I want to say again, thanks so much for presenting this. We had someone also type in, thanks for all the work you're doing on this. Such an important year, such an important time to be doing all these things and to working on it. So thank you so much, Dr. Young, Dr. Sorensen. I know we also had Dr. Latimer who was joining us as an attendee. So all the work that everyone on this webinar is doing around this.
Cool, great.
Great, thanks, Stacy. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.